Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to another book review. Um, I literally just got done reading this. It took me almost a month to read it. It's a long, long book. Um, Ironic given the title of what we're about to talk about here. Um, but been into my Batman readings and decided to finally read this. And um, I definitely have some thoughts about the specific book. Just got done finished reading it. I haven't even finished doing my notes because I usually like to surmise, what I just read. Um, but there was something that happened specifically in what was it, chapter 11, Labor Day, the Labor Day chapter. At the end of the chapter, when they reveal something, I was like, no, I got to read the next chapter immediately. And then I just finished the book. So today we're going to talk about Batman: The Long Halloween. Quite an infamous book, very famous comic. Helped inspired actually a lot of the films, specifically two of the movies. I believe it helped shape a little bit of The Dark Knight, and also shape a little bit of Matt Reeves' Batman. And I believe part two of the Batman, Matt Reeves' Batman, is also taking a little bit of inspiration from this book as well. Um, but this is a story that takes place throughout an entire year, hence why it's called Long Halloween, because the story starts in Halloween, and I believe around the time of Halloween, and there is a mysterious killer who eventually the media labels as Holiday, because this killer only kills during holiday seasons, and in the story, the comic is split into chapters based on each of the holiday seasons that eventually lead back to Halloween. So you start with Halloween, and then you end up in Thanksgiving and Christmas. You end up in New Year's Eve. You end up in all these other holidays, and it is a mystery to who this holiday killer is. Has a fixation. He or she has a fixation on specifically the Falcone family, which is the underbelly of Gotham City, the criminal underworld, people who are pulling the strings, kind of controlling a lot of the interest in the city, uh, and it seems that maybe they have something to do with it, or maybe other people have something to do with it, and Batman navigates through all of these criminals, both in the underworld and, just notorious criminals. You repeat your faces like Joker, Poison Ivy, who else? The Mad Hatter, Catwoman's in it. You know, it's got a lot of characters in it and a lot of suspects to who could be the holiday killer and what is motivating them to do what they are doing. And in summation, ultimately, what the book is about, to its core, is about corruption, and it's about the, the downfall, of an individual. How does one get to that place? What feeds that sensibility? What makes a person, you know, become corrupt? And they show you a lot of, varying, uh, ideas behind that, and this is all spoilers, so we're gonna like kind of really talk a lot about the book. So if you haven't read Long Halloween, I would not recommend watching this video because I'm gonna be talking a lot about stuff that happened in the book, specifically the ending, because I think it's a really, really fascinating ending. Um, because when you find out who the holiday killer is, yeah, I'm getting into spoilers right now. Um, I found it really, and again, I just read it. I found it really interesting that the holiday killer is ultimately a is ultimately just that of a I don't know if I say a metaphor, but a almost I guess in some ways a metaphor for the city crying for help, and the citizens trying to find their own justice in a city that is filled with injustice, and the idea that the holiday killer is not one person, the idea that it is essentially in some ways three people. I mean, ultimately by creation, by who is the one who created the holiday figure, you know, the identity, the creation of it, it comes from Harvey Dent's wife. And it starts with, her desires for her husband to be around. She doesn't want her husband to be consumed and obsessed by all that he is doing, and eventually that is what leads to Harvey Dent's downfall. It's his obsession for trying to bring down, the Falcone family, and in that there's great consequences to it, and the ultimate tragedy is that he starts to enact his own form of justice, but really it is just an extension of that injustice that Gotham is just buried in. Um, but it all originates, it all comes back to somebody who wishes to have, that connection, somebody who wants to be seen, somebody um, who wants to feel accepted, and not, just put down or put to the side, you know. And in some ways, it's also like what the Solomon Grundy character almost represents. He's like in the book very briefly, but the time that he was there is like it kind of gives you an impression of not only what the Falcone family kind of like has done to it's to ordinary citizens, but also making a further comment on corruption and how it affects people around you, and the varying dealings of said corruption. What is it? How did people take that on? In the case of Harvey Dent, it is somebody who was obsessed. Somebody who is who allowed their obsessions to um, to drive them to do heinous things. Even though also when you find out, his wife was doing all these things, it's like you could see ultimately the tragedy that was with Harvey Dent because he gives himself up. Also, it's not like um, he does what he does, right? He eventually kills Carmine Falcone, and he I believe he also kills Vernon too, simply out of revenge for what happened to his face. Um, but he eventually turns himself in. He's not somebody who just runs out and starts killing for no apparent reason. You know, kind of, I guess, in some ways, like the wife was. I mean, was the wife in many ways was like Carla in the book. Somebody who was operating independently, somebody who was trying to, you know, enact, like kind of in many ways, what the book also represents is the varying forms of the terminology of justice. What does it mean? What does it mean to enact justice? Does it mean to act accordingly by the law, or is it just to do the thing to simply what you do, simply leading by what you believe is right? Because in the case of of Batman in this book, when you think about the entire case, in many ways it kind of reminds me of like Seven, where the detectives lose, at the end of the day. It's a story that where our heroes lose. It's not about these heroes winning at the end of the day. They get something out of it, sure, but how it is gotten, how they get to that place, how they achieve that goal, it is still shrouded in corruption and shrouded in darkness. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. There's still great despair and great tragedy that came about, getting to that goal because, you know, there's a relationship that's built between Batman, Harvey Dent, and James Gordon. They all share the same goal is to bring down the Falcone family. But as it's kind of alluded to in the book, Harvey is more extreme. Harvey is willing to do the extremes. He alludes to the idea that that maybe they should do things a little bit more, aggressive, whereas Batman and James are, being the opposite to that, where they're wanting to uphold, their belief, and I love the way that the book ends, where each individual, right, is talking about it, their own belief systems. James Gordon, believes in the city. Bruce believes in Batman and what Batman stands for. And Harvey's wife believes in her husband and what he had stood for. It's a story about belief and the power of belief and the power of, you know, of you know, of that, of that moral framework. And again, that whole definition of that whole spinning of the definition of justice and how people, take to that sort of thing. Um, it's a really, really, I think it's a really, really fascinating read. I do take issue. My one issue with the book that I had was it is a bit long winded. There are, especially in the middle, where a lot of things aren't necessarily moving forward, but now upon reading, these last few chapters, it's there for a reason. It's there to stew. It's there to marinate. It's there to also, to establish, the idea of multiple individuals, being the holiday figure. It's not just, there for certain. It's not just there just to have characters introduced, but ultimately, in terms of the read, it doesn't exactly progress the story forward. I'm not sitting there feeling like, okay, now we're like moving forward, and oh yeah, there's a great purpose for, all these characters to exist. You know, all of them just kind of feel like there's a reason for them to be there, but at the same time, it's more personalized. It's not something that is in direct uh, connection to the main plot line. It feels like we kind of explore other plot lines, and there's a reason for that. At the end of the day, Batman is wrong. Batman is on the wrong path. He was looking, investigating in the wrong places. And I thought, that Harvey Dent was going to be uh, the holiday killer, and I guess to some extent he is, because as Batman says at the end of the book, you know, Harvey Dent technically is also Holiday, because, well, Holiday's official last kill to some extent is Carmine Falcone on Holiday Night, which brings it all back full circle, you know. And the great tragedy of that, again, the great tragedy of, you know, a character, who ultimately wanted to do the right thing, but was just pushed too far and decided to take his own actions and strip away, what it is that he was trying to do, and just decide to go enact violence. Um, but I love how at the end, Batman's trying to rationalize it. Batman's trying his best to try to rationalize the situation, and he can't. He can't. And ultimately, he never will. It's a case that will remain unsolved officially, even though there is some resolution, even though Alberto Falcone, kind of takes the fall for all of it. Um, it's only a piece of the puzzle. It's not the entire truth. And again, it all falls back to corruption and lies, and and the the rationale behind enacting injustice. What is it? What motivates people to do the things that they do? And I think all of that is just really, really interesting. My only gripe with the book, like I said, is just that it just feels like at some point we are kind of just chasing our own tail. Like, I don't mind some of the chapters, like, the chapter with Poison Ivy, and the chapter with Scarecrow. Like, those are not bad chapters, but I just feel like that they also don't really push the plot forward. They just kind of feel like they're just there just to contribute to a side plot, but not really to the main story at hand. It's not till later on does the story kind of really start to push forward and really start to, kind of move in a certain direction, Um, but it's still an intriguing story, and I really love how, like, just sitting with it now, just like I really really love, how how it just ends. The fact that it's not one person, and that it is it's a collective of people who have, in one way or another, have been struggling, and they have all desired some kind of connection, some kind of validation, and some kind of belonging, or some kind of like just peace of mind. In the case of like Gilda, all she ever wanted was to be with her husband, but because of his obsession with this case, she fell to great darkness, and she decided to, you know, to enact violence because of it. Alberto Falcone is because he desired a connection with his father, but his father was always working, and never had time to be around his son. I never wanted him involved in the business, at all. So at that point, Alberto decides to fake his own death and to enact his own injustice. He gets pushed into great darkness. And Harvey's is, well, all to do with, his great obsession and about his desire to ultimately do the right thing, but was pushed to the point where the right thing just didn't seem right anymore. And what was wrong felt better and was just ultimately right in his eyes. So it's some ways, when it's all done said and done, it's a tragic story. It's a tragic story about consequence, and or not a tragic story about consequence, but a tragic story about of corruption, and the motivation behind said corruption. Um, so so I really enjoy this book. I really do. I'm tempted to say it might be my favorite comic right now. I don't know. I really did like Kingdom Come a lot. Um, so this might be like number two for me. I really really liked it. Like I said, the only gripe that I have with it is that I feel like it's a bit long-winded. I feel like you could have cut out some of the fat in the story, especially with some of the utilizations of certain characters like Poison Ivy and Scarecrow. It just felt like we were almost like paying attention to other things over here, but it makes sense within the confines of what they're telling as a story, and how it's, in terms of Batman, in terms of that character, what his focus is on, and how it all plays out in the end. It makes total sense why they're doing it that way. I'm just saying it for, as the reader, it just feels a little long-winded, but as a read, though, it was still really really fascinating, and I really really like how it all just kind of wrapped up in this message of, corruption and the motivations behind it. I think that that's just a really really interesting way to end it. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I really really did enjoy it, and it makes me interested to see what the next book is. I know the next one that I supposedly should be reading is Dark Victory, which is the sequel to The Long Halloween. So that might be where I jump next. I don't know. I've been curious to read more Superman. I might jump back to Superman for a little bit. Don't know. I will say that my next book, I bought it. I wish I can grab it. Is Clayface book, the one shot comic. I'll put it right here. Um, that's what I plan on reading on next. So I will be reading that next, and then we'll see whether or not I jump into Dark Victory or, another Superman comic. So we'll see then. But I really enjoyed this. This was a really good read. I had a really good time reading it. I was always fascinated to like figure out who the Holiday Killer was. At some points I thought it was Harvey Dent. I actually thought, legitimately, I thought it was going to be Vernon. Of all the characters, I thought it was going to be Vernon, because it always seemed like as if, Vernon was always integrated within the system. He knew Sal. He, was always kind of around. He knew Harvey Dent. I always thought it was him for some reason, but it, it turned out to not be him at all, and he was killed, later on anyway. I mean, Vernon, I guess, was just an asshole. Vernon was just, in it for his own interests, which again plays back to the whole idea of the book. So, I really like how a lot of the book is played within that framework, that thematic, study that it wishes to present. It's not some of it, again, like I said, kind of tacked in and kind of sidetracking, but it serves some kind of purpose though when it's all said and done. So, so yeah, I enjoyed the book. You guys, let me know your thoughts on The Long Halloween if you guys have read it. It is a long read. The Long Halloween, it's a long read, but well worth it in my opinion if you ever get a chance to read it. A good mystery, definitely an interesting mystery. Like I said, it kind of feels like we started with the mystery and then we kind of sidetracked and started doing other things, namely with Carmine Falcone. But I do like ultimately how that kind of feeds into, Batman and his own journey within the book, with his own agenda, with, trying to find out who the killer is, to then be proven wrong, and to never really find resolve, to never really find, peace, in that situation. And it ends on a tragic note. It ends, with tragedy, not with hopefulness. Harvey Dent presents the idea of hope, but it never feels that way. You know, it feels more like something dark just happened, something filled with just corruption, not with genuineness or with righteousness. Or with a sense of pride and spirit, or hope for the city. It's just it just feels dirty, and I like ultimately that is the feeling that is left for the viewer, or for the reader. So, but let me know your thoughts on The Long Halloween if you guys have read it. I know that it's been adapted, the actual comic, it's been adapted into an animated film, and like I said before at the beginning of the video, it's been used as some inspirations for the live action films, namely the Dark Knight. And I believe the Batman Part Two is using it as a inspiration. But let me know all your thoughts relating to the book in the comment section below. And that's gonna be it for this video, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. And until then, I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye.